Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Amy Conacher, and I am the Executive Director of the Australian American Chamber of Commerce here in Texas, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Before we get into the introductions of our speakers, I want to just say thank you to the Australian American Chamber in San Francisco and in the Pacific Northwest, to Dalton Millington in San Francisco and Doran Katz more specifically in Pacific Northwest. It has been an honor to be able to do this joint event with them. And we're really excited that this hopefully will become an annual event that we can get together as the three chambers here in the United States. I'd like to now pass over to a very special guest that we have tonight who is going to provide the opening remarks, Ambassador Sina Dimas.
Thank you to the Australian American Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to welcome everyone to this important event. The AACC is a strong supporter of the Australian-American business relationship, so it's gratifying that it now has three chapters. Welcome Pacific Northwest members, and of course welcome San Francisco and Texas members as well. You have a top lineup of speakers today, and I'm disappointed that I cannot be there with you in person to hear what they have to say. Reducing emissions while growing our economies and jobs is a global challenge and opportunity, and for Australia, it is about taking major initiatives to drive sustainability across the economy. Last week saw the passage of the government's legislation committing Australia to our new 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by below 2005 levels, and we are urgently implementing new measures across the economy to meet this ambitious target and drive the transition to net zero. Why this event and the upcoming discussion is so important is that the aviation industry has a significant role to play in decarbonising the transport sector, and it's critical that we work together on bio-based renewable fuels. Australia can play a significant role in the research and supply chain of aviation fuel alternatives. Our national science agency, CSIRO, has strong strategic relationships into the aviation industry, both domestically and internationally. Here in the US, CSIRO worked closely in Seattle with Boeing, a relationship spanning more than 30 years. CSIRO are focused on emerging sustainable aviation fuel pathways, including their own technologies aimed at unlocking new feedstock options, including biomass, oil crops, algae and hydrogen. All possible game changers that the speakers today will expand on. Australia will also be at the forefront of the transition to cleaner transport, thanks to our significant reserves of critical battery minerals. Here in the US, the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act will provide opportunities for Australia to supply critical minerals on a preferred basis to the US electric vehicle industry. But more than digging minerals out of the ground and shipping them overseas, our government is supporting processing in Australia. We're also focused on improving battery technology through research and development at the CSIRO and the Future Battery Industries Cooperative Research Centre. In the United States, Australian companies are supporting the scale-up of battery technology. Tritium, which manufactures electric vehicle fast charging stations, listed on the New York Stock Exchange this year. And I was fortunate enough to attend the opening of their new manufacturing facility in Tennessee last month. Novonix opened a synthetic graphite plant, a key input for batteries, also in Tennessee this year. And CSIRO Resources was awarded a Department of Energy loan to build a graphite processing facility in Louisiana. We're always pleased to see Australian companies doing well in the US, and the success of these companies comes at a time of broader policy alignment between the US and Australia on these issues. We share an ambition to make low emissions technologies globally scalable and commercially viable to rapidly accelerate global emissions reductions and reach net zero emissions. Our Prime Minister's aspiration is to make climate cooperation a third pillar of the alliance. At the Sydney Energy Forum in July, Minister for Climate and Energy Chris Bowen and United States Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm signed the Australia-United States Net Zero Technology Acceleration Partnership. This partnership will accelerate the development and deployment of zero emissions technology and cooperate on critical mineral supply chains to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while supercharging economic growth. There are many technology areas of shared interest and priority between the US and Australia. They include long-duration energy storage, digital electricity grids, direct air capture, and clean hydrogen, to name a few. Australia and the US co-lead Mission Innovation 2.0 Clean Hydrogen Mission, which has the goal to reduce the end-to-end costs of clean hydrogen production to $2 per kilo by 2030. This would be a tipping point in making clean hydrogen cost competitive with other energy sources. Australia and the US also work closely together in the research and innovation pillar of the Clean Hydrogen Mission, leading working groups to improve hydrogen storage and distribution and hydrogen-powered fuel cells, respectively. Australia is a world leader in renewable energy. In 2020, Australia deployed new renewable energy at nearly 8 times the global per capita average and more than 4 times the OECD average. Nearly 1/3 of Australian homes have rooftop solar with a combined capacity of 17 gigawatts. This is a virtual power station comprising more than 3 million rooftops, the largest generator in Australia. In agriculture, innovations such as Future Feed, which is a seaweed, has the potential to reduce methane emissions from livestock by at least 90%. The seaweed feed supplement was developed by the CSIRO and is now being scaled up across Australia and around the world, including here in the United States. Australia is also developing carbon recycling technologies that transform CO2 into economically viable products such as chemicals, synthetic fuels, and building materials. Australian companies are taking action to green their supply chains too. Rio Tinto and BHP recently signed an MOU with shipping companies to work to develop green shipping corridors for iron ore in East Asia. In the United States, Australian companies are leveraging recycling and clean energy resources. BlueScope Steel has expanded the capacity of its North Star mill, one of the cleanest steel mills in the country, and has acquired recycling facilities in the United States. And Pratt Industries is expanding its recycling operations across the United States. There's so much happening to make the global economy more sustainable, and there are big opportunities for thinkers and innovators like yourselves to take a leading role in creating new ideas and products that are of great benefit to the world. Thank you for your time today and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much. I would like to now introduce Kevin Wilhelm. Kevin is the CEO of Sustainable Business Consulting, and he brings 20 years of experience working with over 275 clients to realize positive brand value from better social and environmental practices. Kevin is a thought leader, a strategist, a lecturer, and an author in the sustainability field, and has worked with Delta, Alaska Airlines, SkyWest, Wheels Up, Amazon, and many more. Welcome, Kevin, and we appreciate you being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy, and thanks for everyone for attending tonight. As Amy mentioned, my name's Kevin Wilhelm, and I'll be moderating this amazing panel that we have with us tonight. I know many of you have already read their bios in the information that was handed out and sent out ahead of time, but we're very fortunate in that we have 3 wonderful speakers here, Frannie Levar from United Airlines, Heidi Hauf from Boeing, James Deverell from CSIRO Futures, as was mentioned just now. And what we're going to do and how today is going to play out is that each of our speakers is going to do a quick overview to let you know kind of what they are doing in this space. And then we're going to have some moderated questions and then open it up to Q&A for everyone in the audience. So for those of you who are going through this, feel free to put questions in the chat box. We'll be looking at them and embracing them and finding ways to weave them in throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in and introduce our first speaker. Frannie Levar is the Director of Environmental Sustainability at United Airlines. She's responsible for leading not only development and implementation of environmental and climate requirements, but also sustainability initiatives as part of United's overall global environmental strategy. Obviously, she leads a team of professionals with technical expertise, and her portfolio supports United's focus not only in compliance excellence, but on their pledge to be 100% green by 2050. But rather than going too long, I'm just going to hand it over to Frannie, and feel free to take it away from here, Frannie.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to the Chamber for having me. I'm excited to join you all today. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about United Airlines climate ambition. I could go on for a long time, but I'm going to try and keep it to around 5 minutes and very high level. United has long held sustainability as a key operating principle. And so the idea of addressing climate change and our responsibility around it is not a new topic. If we move to the next visual here, we will see that our existing CEO has been a very vocal champion of sustainability. While United has certainly been no stranger to this as a focus area, as I mentioned, he has really sort of skyrocketed the subject to a whole new level and really allowed for the permeation of sustainability even further across our enterprise. And so, you know, he has been very clear to recognize that as an airline, the industry at large is contributing to climate change and thus has a responsibility to contribute to the solve. And so that's in large part why we have set such aggressive goals and do so with the unique perspective of not relying on the traditional use of offsets. And so in order to sort of put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, we've made 2 pledges. We will be zeroing out our emissions by 2050. And then we've also set a nearer term goal to reduce the carbon intensity of our footprint by 2035 as compared to 2019. And so what is it that we're trying to solve for? Well, our greenhouse gas footprint, 98% of that is derived from the use of conventional jet fuel. It's a significant problem that requires significant resources and time and effort. And so, you know, the remainder of our footprint, around 2%, comprises the entirety of our remaining operations, some of which is just briefly mentioned here. So how do we intend to get there? Well, our strategy is a 3-pronged approach that is outlined a bit on the next slide here. But essentially, we're going to be focusing on the removal of emissions, the reduction of emissions, and then innovating above and beyond existing technologies. So the reduction of emissions, that's largely at this point in time focused on driving scalable use of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. The use of SAF can result in at least an 80% reduction over the life cycle as compared to conventional jet fuel. A massive, massive opportunity for us in the use of SAF. And the critical piece to that is that using alternative fuels does not drive any other infrastructure needs or changes to our aircraft. It is a drop-in ready solution. That's been a large focus of United, as seen in a lot of the innovations we've made around some of the fuel producers and things like that, and our advocacy work in trying to leverage policy, again, to sort of drive that production of SAF at scale. The second sort of pillar of our strategy is around the removal of those carbon emissions. As I mentioned, the use of SAF will get us roughly 80% of the way there, but certainly not in its entirety. And so we're looking at, again, ways to remove those emissions that we cannot address through those reduction measures. Removal of CO2 from the air through things like carbon sequestration and technologies that either will sequester carbon dioxide permanently or use it as a subsequent pathway to create valuable products like SAF. The third pillar is around really innovating and driving the next generation of decarbonization solutions. Those things that we need to rely on beyond what's available in the marketplace today. And those, again, are evident in part of some of the initiatives that United, or excuse me, the investments United has made around things like electric aircraft, hydrogen fuel cells, those low or zero carbon technologies that will be more viable for us in the mid and longer term. Again, all of this is underlined through significant, consistent collaboration across the value chain. Climate change is not a problem that was singularly created, nor will the solutions be. And so while 98% of our footprint is derived from fuels and is thus a primary concern for us, I would be remiss if we did not focus for a minute on some of the things that we're also doing to address the emissions generated from other aspects of our operation. As you can see on the next visual, there's a little bit of some of the focus areas that United is currently addressing to take care of the emissions from those other operational areas. You know, we are driving a clean energy strategy and focusing on electrification. We are optimizing our recycling and really thinking about how to minimize our waste footprint and also reduce the generation of waste to begin with, again, through evaluations of the products that we are purchasing through our supply chain, the onboard products. All of this is to sort of signify that we recognize we must be comprehensive in our approach, and we must demonstrate our commitment and our leadership through some of those tangible changes that are signified here on this slide. And so it's also really an opportunity to further engage our customers and our employee body in the journey in ways that sort of allows for that sophisticated message around fuels to get through, while also providing them sort of an opportunity to remain engaged and participate through some of those behavior changes that we all know are so critical. Kevin, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Frannie. That was an awesome overview, and I think for so many people, it's so illustrative to see that when you talk about the 98% is the Gen A fuel, which is what we're here talking about. I think there's a lot of people that get on planes and feel very good about recycling and you know, their cups, and it's really not where the impact is. So really appreciate you explaining that and going into so much detail. Next, we're gonna switch over to our manufacturing partner, Boeing, and Heidi Hauf is here. She's was appointed to the role of regional sustainability lead back in January of 21, but she leads Boeing's sustainable aviation activity, which includes a whole bunch of things: policy advocacy. She informs strategy and technical roadmaps. She also develops partnerships in support of the aerospace sustainability goals all across the Asian Pacific region and APAC. And she chairs industry groups, including the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand and Aviation Aerospace Australia Green Skies. She's got quite the resume that is too long to go over. So before we do that, we're just going to hand it over to Heidi and tell us what's going on with Boeing and what you're doing here.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and hello, everyone. Thank you to the Australian American Chambers for bringing this event together and giving us a chance to explain how we're approaching this really challenging and exciting area of the industry. I wanted to start just briefly I thought it might be useful, particularly for those joining from the US, to give a little bit of context about Boeing in Australia. So it's a really good time to do that. This year we are celebrating 95 years in Australia, and that started in 1927 with aeroplane manufacturing with de Havilland, Australia. And some may not know that Australia became a leading producer of military and commercial aircraft through the years of the Second World War. And after some mergers and acquisitions, it's become Boeing as we know it today, one of the leading aerospace companies in the region and definitely in Australia. Today we have over 4,500, just under 4,500 employees, Australian employees employed locally across Australian-owned, wholly owned subsidiaries in the commercial business, defence and space, as well as our global services. So the full suite of Boeing's US and global expertise is got a firm footprint in Australia. Of course, we work really closely through suppliers, and we have a very big supplier footprint, over 2,000 suppliers and an annual spend of 400 million. And a part of that supply chain engagement is a program of work to try and build the capability of our Indigenous owned suppliers within Australia. And that's been really successful so far. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a $34 million spend with our Indigenous owned companies. We also have a really good R&D program with some great success coming out of the research. We have a Boeing Research and Technology Centre and quite a big footprint in country. And we have partnerships with universities all around Australia. And of course, as mentioned by the Ambassador, a long-standing 30+ year partnership with CSIRO. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context about Boeing in Australia. Moving on to the point at hand, and as sustainable aerospace. So in the recent, sorry, Amy, if you could move on to the next chart, please. The purpose of the Boeing company is to protect, connect, and explore the world beyond. And I find that a really inspiring purpose and really appropriate to when we're thinking about sustainability and the future of sustainable aerospace. So building on a legacy of leadership and innovation in sustainable aviation, Boeing in 2020 appointed our Chief Sustainability Officer, Chris Raymond, and just this July we released our second sustainability report. So this is us building on that legacy, but really pulling together a more comprehensive approach to sustainability, and that looks across environment, social, and governance. What I'm going to cover up today is that in the environment area, and particularly around our emissions profile and that decarbonisation. We recently released a narrative around how we tackle this challenge, and we've called it Everything for Zero, basically highlighting the need that we need, the point that we need a portfolio of solutions to get to net zero in the sector, and we really need to work together. So it really is everything for zero, and those collaborations are crucial. We expect that by 2050, we will have around 10 billion people flying per year. And so if you think about that amazing growth in the industry, how this industry helps us live amazing lives and bring opportunities to all parts of the world, we really need to find ways to decouple emissions from that growth. And we also need to help the industry commitment to net zero by 2050. IATA made that commitment last year. And so the way the Boeing looks at this is, as you can see on this chart, under 4 strategies. And the first one is fleet renewal, which is actually a really significant immediate way for the sector to reduce emissions. Every time a new aircraft comes in, you can imagine it incorporates a whole bunch of design improvements and some of the technologies that have been tested and incorporated. And depending on what fleet's being replaced, you can see a 15 to 25% reduction in emissions just by bringing in new fleet. The second strategy is operational efficiency, and this is looking at how we fly the aircraft and all the tools and data that we can use to help the aircraft in flight, landing, and through maintenance be maintained and operated more efficiently. And there's a bunch of different aspects to this, but all up you can get up to 10% emission reductions from operational efficiency. The next pillar, the next strategy there is renewable energy, and really that's where we're talking about today. It's focus of this is for us is sustainable aviation fuel, but we need green hydrogen also in our sustainable aviation fuel production, as well as we look at hydrogen as a potential fuel for future flight, and as well as renewable energy and green electrons in the electricity grids all over the world using renewable energy. We think about renewable energy across the full life cycle, and we can talk about more of that in discussions when we're talking about what are sustainable aviation fuels and how are they categorized that way. But the life cycle of the fuel and the life cycle of the aircraft is something that's really important to us when we think about how we're manufacturing and how we're enabling our customers to fly more efficiently. And then finally, the last strategy is around advanced technologies. And this includes a whole bunch of research into hydrogen flight, including testing of cryogenic tanks that we would need to use to store the hydrogen in flight. We have a big investment in a electrical vertical and lift company called Whisk, which is helping us understand what both autonomous flight looks like, but also increasingly electrified flight. And that aspects of that innovation help us in current flight platforms as well as those for the future. We also released just recently a tool that helps us understand how all of these different technologies can be applied. They're all at different levels of maturity, and in different regions of the world, different policies will mean that we see maturity come about differently and at different stages. And so this cascade tool that we've just released helps organizations, and for us now just internally, to understand how bringing in different elements of these 4 strategies might help us reach net zero. I just wanted to finish with this chart, which a lot of you might have seen. It's from the Air Transport Action Group ATAG 2050 WATAG 2050 report. It's really useful because I think it helps us understand why sustainable aviation fuel is so important. And if you look at the top part of the chart, those top rows, it's the smaller segments, the more regional flights. and it shows you the emissions that sector of flight is net right now, and that's 27% of global carbon emissions from flight. And you can see that we're going to see in more closer years, 25, 30, some new technologies, hydrogen and electric coming into play, but SAF still plays a role. But if you look into the bottom two rows, you can see there's 73% of the emissions profile, and that's for long haul flights, medium haul flights. And for some time into the future, we're going to be reliant on sustainable aviation fuels until those other technologies allow us to be used in those longer haul segments to reduce emissions. So hopefully that's helpful as a starter, and I'll finish up there and hand back to you, Kevin. Thank you. Oh, Kevin, or at least I don't have your audio.
Yep. Thanks. I was going to, sorry, classic Zoom thing. I did that. So thanks so much for Heidi for that great overview. And I loved how you ended on that slide and the way you did, just so that it really got a chance for people to see all the different things that are going there and the 4 different ways that Boeing is approaching this. So we're going to hand it over to James here, and he is going to walk us through some of the stuff that he's doing. And so this is James Deverell. He's the director of CSIRO Futures, which is a strategy advisory arm of Australia's National Science Agency. He leads a team that builds on deep research and expertise to help clients create sustainable growth by harnessing a lot of the emerging technologies and innovation that we've just been talking about. He brings over 25 years of experience in the commercial and government clients across 4 different continents, and he's led a number of large-scale initiatives, including the Australian National Outlook, the National Hydrogen Roadmap, and the Low Emissions Technology Roadmap. So without further ado, James, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Kevin. And thank you, Amy, and to the Chamber as well for the invitation to join today. These types of forums are near and dear to my heart as an American Australian who lives in Sydney and maintains close business ties back to the US as well. So look, there's a couple of things I thought I would touch on briefly to start out. So we've heard from both Frannie and Heidi about just how important SAF is going to be to the industry in terms of reducing emissions. And aviation is a tricky industry because it's one of those so-called hard to abate industries where we don't necessarily have the same range of options that we have in other industries. And I guess when we look out, we're involved in a lot of the research behind that. As well as a lot of the analysis that underpins that. And when we look out, there's kind of 3 different time horizons we look at in terms of SAF development. In the near term, we've got SAF from biogenic fuel, from biogenic sources, and that's a commercially viable solution that's already being installed around the world, is already producing SAF. And that's going to be the go-to for the next, the near term. When we look into the more medium term, there are some other pathways, some other technologies that could be really promising, like electrofuels or what often are called power to liquids, which take CO2 and hydrogen and combine that into a fuel. And then in the very long run, and Heidi touched on this, there's an opportunity to actually use hydrogen as a fuel source in and of itself. But there's some pretty significant technical challenges that will need to be overcome to make that viable for aviation. In terms of what we're doing at the CSIRO as Australia's National Science Agency, I mentioned one component of that is in the analysis and advisory work that we do, and that my team have been directly involved in a number of different projects to support that. And that's really about informing policymakers and investors in Australia and around the world so that they can make informed decisions, both in the governance and regulatory side and also on the investment side. So those are things like the National Hydrogen Roadmap that we published back in 2018 in Australia. we've been working closely with the Royal Australian Air Force over the last year to advise them on their SAF strategy, their sustainable fuel strategy. And very, very happy to say that we're also going to be collaborating with Boeing on a SAF roadmap for Australia and the Asia Pacific region to look at the different options that we have both in Australia and across that region. The second thing that we're doing at CSIRO is, in line with our role as a national science agency, is really looking at how we can accelerate the deployment and the demonstration and deployment of these technologies. And one of the key vehicles that we're using for that are our national missions program. So we have recently announced our first 4 missions, and one of those is the hydrogen mission. And what these are is national scale programs focused on the big, hairy problems that we face in Australia and around the world that we're working on in collaboration with industry at scale and with a relatively short time horizon to get those technologies out into industry and commercialized. So that hydrogen mission is very much focused on getting the cost of hydrogen production down. And we heard the ambassador talk about the target of $2 a kilogram. And so we're working on a variety of different technologies in that space. Similarly, we have a up and coming mission called Towards Net Zero that will be focused on a wider range of decarbonization technologies for the aviation sector and other sectors as well across the Australian economy. And then the third aspect of CSIRO's work is the enabling science and technology that will underpin all of that. So looking at things like our work in green hydrogen production and transport, particularly looking at things like ammonia as a carrier for green hydrogen, our work in direct air capture as a technology to actually pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, which of course would be a potential input into that electrofuels pathway to generate SAF. And then also looking at the work that we do in sustainable agriculture. Agriculture is actually CSIRO's largest area of research, and sustainable ag is a big focus for us going ahead. And one of the key aspects there is the work that we're doing in life cycle assessment as well, which of course is something that's going to be very important when you start talking about sustainable fuels. Is not just looking at the potential for emissions reduction at point of combustion, but also looking across that entire life cycle as well, particularly when you're looking at things like biofuels. So that's just a very quick overview of the work that we're doing at CSIRO. Yeah, very much looking forward to the panel discussion that comes out of this. So Kevin, back over to you.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks for all the panels. There was definitely a strategy for how we had each one of the panelists explain what's going on, and I think it's super exciting to talk about where things are headed. And I think, James, that was a great way of segueing off what Heidi and Frannie had to say. I want to throw this to the panelists. One of the questions that we seem to be getting is that for people that are trying to, in the airline industry that are trying to really lean into sustainable aviation fuels or SAF, for a lot of reasons, it comes down to availability. There's not enough of it, and price. And can you three talk about maybe how, or one of you who's really in it, maybe Frannie, you want to start? Like, what's going on there in terms of how is there a path forward on those two issues? Because it seems to me that every person I talk to in the aerospace industry, that's where they first come to is they say, we want to do it, there just isn't enough of it. And the second part is, I'm trying to convince my CFO to do it, but the price just isn't compatible, and we're coming out of a recession, so we can't really do it right now. And can each of you kind of talk about how you're navigating those situations?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then I'd love to sort of hear other thoughts or perspectives. You're right. It's a tricky problem, particularly as we emerge from a pandemic. There's still a lot of sort of focus on being financially conservative and making sure your dollars are spent appropriately. And SAF is not available at scale by a long shot. We've been using SAF regularly in our operation since 2016, and it accounts for a single-digit percentile of what we need on an annual basis. There is not enough SAF to supply our airline alone, let alone the industry on a global level. A lot of times that part of what we're trying to sort of advocate for is some of those policy levers and those incentives that sort of allow the idea of SAF production to be a little bit more enticing for those fuel producers. Certainly, one example would be in California, there's the low carbon fuel standard. That sort of creates a little bit more parity for your costs when comparing sustainable aviation fuel from an alternative feedstock to your conventional jet fuel. Certainly, this is a timely discussion because in the United States, the IRA was just patched, and that includes a blender's tax credit, which will create the opportunity for more producers to start evaluating production of SAF from alternative feedstocks, and it's more economical. It's now a more viable option. I think in previous discussions that this panel has had, there was the acknowledgement that there is no SAF production currently in Australia. And so, while maybe there's some incremental change progress starting to happen in the United States, this is a global problem. We need these sort of levers. We need these sort of incentives across the globe at a scale that we have not yet seen, and certainly at a speed we have not yet seen. So curious to hear from Heidi or James what your thoughts are on in addition.
Thanks very much. Jump in next. 100% agree with everything that you've said, and I guess I'd add to that, or maybe double down on that policy and the importance of policy. What we've seen from really being a strong advocate for the growth of sustainable aviation fuel technology, certification, and commercialization globally is that the jurisdictions where there is some policy and financial incentive or mechanism is the only place where SAF is successfully being commercially made. So there's various ways that's happening. So we heard some already about the recent developments in the US. In the EU, there is legislation coming in that will implement a mandate for sustainable aviation fuel for any flight within or leaving the EU. And it's interesting because different parts of the world have different requirements within that SAF. What SAF is acceptable. So within the EU, there will be a portion of that mandate that's required to be synthetic fuel, and you heard James talk a little bit about that before, and also non-crop-based sustainable aviation fuel. So we're seeing these complexity of regional policies, mandates, financial incentives like the low carbon fuel standard. And I think that's what's really important is to keep some of the organizations that are in place looking at a global scale, and to keep the conversation around the sustainability of the SAF life cycle, particularly feedstocks, as more and more technical pathways come into play. And diversity is actually really key in this, having diverse ways to make the fuel and diversity of feedstocks allow us to scale SAF. It's really important to focus on the land use change, how we're certifying these fuels as sustainable livelihoods, and how they're growing jobs in regional areas and parts of the world that need economic development. So the policy is really, really important to scaling SAF, and it can get into a bit of a chicken and egg conversation around demand and production, but policy is an unlock.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's the chicken and egg problem, right? Because we know as we scale up, costs will come down with scale. But the problem is getting that investment money in to scale up in the first place when it's not a commercially profitable entity as things stand. So I think certainly a role for policy. I think from our side, we're hopeful as well that science and technology can lead to cost reductions. Certainly when we look at things like CO2 capture, when we look at hydrogen production, there's a significant amount of cost reduction that can happen through R&D there as well. One other thing I'd touch on, in addition to those policy levers, and not unique to Australia, but a big challenge for Australia, is the domestic fuel supply and fuel security in Australia. Frannie, you're exactly right. We produce no SAF in Australia at the moment. And in fact, we import almost all of our liquid fuels. And so if you look at it from a defense perspective, there's a strong imperative to improve our sovereign fuel supply in Australia. And I think that's potentially another avenue, to get defense and commercial working together to promote those investments that need to happen.
That's a great point, James. And well, all your points were great, but just riffing right off of that, because I think people think that the interstate highway system here in the United States was built for commercial purposes, but it was really a defense reasoning for it that led to its initial creation, along with things like the internet as well. And so if we bring that mindset to sustainable aviation fuels, as opposed to traditional, business antics of saying, okay, we've got to make it, a certain way, that can really help break down those barriers a little bit. I love how, as people were, everyone was going through here, we had another question in the chat that you've talked about, the challenges that are there and what needs to happen from a policy, but Heidi, you really talked about collaboration and what's really needed. I know that's kind of where it comes down, but where are you seeing the collaboration between, say, America and the Australian industries, the chambers, to support this? I think, so often everyone gets caught up in the, why can't we get more and what's going wrong? Can you talk a little about what's going right so far?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's really important at this point just to mention the immense amount of work that's been happening for the last few decades behind the scenes, in trying to advance sustainable aviation fuel from a technology and feedstock pathway production point of view, as well as policy. And it feels like there's a lot of things just kind of moons aligning and things are happening, but just wanted to recognize the immense amount of work that's happened over the last few decades. I think one thing I'll point to is, I guess, where Boeing's seeing this collaboration between the US and Australia. There's a lot of expertise in the US with fuel production and some companies that are really leading on sustainable aviation fuel. Boeing recently announced a strategic partnership with Alders Fuel, and based out of the US, and that is going to be similar to our partnership that we have with Sky Energy. They're based out of the Netherlands. These two companies we see as really leading in sustainable aviation fuel technologies. They both have different approaches and different skill sets, and our strategic partnerships are about helping them share their knowledge across the industry with partners and potential commercial operators in Australia. And helping to develop that ecosystem around SAF. James mentioned that we don't have SAF production in Australia, and although we have had fuel production, there's going to be some elements of SAF production in the supply chain and infrastructure that we need to develop. So that collaboration and sharing knowledge and expertise is really key. We are looking at where we can, investing in particularly through offtake, so securing offtake for our own operations where we manufacture and assemble and test planes, to kind of support the SAF demand side. We have a really big investment internally in advocacy. And I have to say, I think it's been really nice for me in Australia as chair of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance to see a really collegiate approach. We have fuel producers, we have distributors, we have airports, we have airlines, and we have some arms of government. And there's this real sense of industry collaboration to get us to this point. And obviously there's competitive points once we are producing, but this sense of working together to help those, particularly in policy, but also across investor landscape, understand the urgency and some of the barriers that we need to push through for SAF. So that hopefully that touches on some of the collaborations and how they're working across the two countries.
Absolutely. And somebody put in the chat to me directly. You mentioned Sky Energy, and what was the other company?
Alders Fuel.
Alders Fuel. Okay.
Sorry, Alder Fuels. ALDER.
Okay, sounds good. Frannie or James, do you want to say anything on that question about what excites you about the partnership that's going on?
Frannie, you want to start? So I'll just jump in quickly. So agree completely with what Heidi said. I think, knowledge sharing for us is a big component of that as a research organization. The U.S. is our largest research partner, and so there's a lot going on back and forth there. We're running a $5 million program right now to look at international RD&D, research, development, and deployment collaborations in hydrogen production. So target countries, obviously the U.S., Germany, and in Europe, Korea, Japan, and really looking at ways that we can focus in our research and take the best of what's being done in other countries like the United States and work with that in Australia as well. So yeah, very, very important for us as a research entity.
My perspective would probably to even expand the notion of collaboration beyond the important partnership between the US and Australia, but really sort of looking at it globally and across the supply chain, is that we're seeing this really interesting momentum build that I've not experienced before. It seems like in the recent few years, we're sort of, as somebody who's been in the sustainability space for a long time, we're starting to sort of see the things we've been asking for, right? We're starting to sort of see this interest across the supply chain from folks that perhaps maybe were not otherwise engaged or interested in thinking about sustainability, to now sort of being a little bit more proactive in asking those questions. What does this really mean? And we've had a lot of really interesting discussions, both internally and externally, about thinking about how sustainability applies to their particular operations, their particular business line or function, such that it's really being embedded as the lens through which an entity perhaps operates, less so just a check marks or some compliance obligation they've got to meet in order to make an investor happy or an external stakeholder happy. We're really starting to see a mind shift outside of maybe what historically has been kind of a like-minded group of people. And I think that's being displayed evidently, again, through the Inflation Reduction Act that we just saw, the most massive policy package around climate to date in our country, certainly. And a lot of other sort of more tangible examples of people really recognizing that we have a crisis we've got to reckon with, and there's an interest in sort of addressing it collaboratively across the supply chain. And I think that's been the part that is really exciting, and I really look forward to further exploring, because therein, and I believe the ambassador said it, this, it's a global challenge, but also an opportunity, which is such a huge point, right? And so therein lies a lot of opportunity for that creativity to sort of really embed sustainability across the supply chain and among partnerships, whether it's at the government level, the market level, the customer level, what have you.
Great. And in terms of this, I think, Heidi, you touched on this a little bit about the importance of, looking at the social aspect of this in terms of land use action, economic development in other countries. I think we saw that in the in the early 2000s and mid 2000s here during the Bush administration, where there was a push for ethanol, and how it helped, and they went to rural communities and pitched it as economic development as opposed to an environmental initiative, and how it was really adopted. Can you all just take, I think everyone, when they talk about kind of sustainability in the aviation industry, everyone immediately goes to climate, everyone immediately goes to fuel, but can you just each take, we're almost out of time, just like 1 minute about how you're incorporating the social side of sustainability and the human element into kind of your work you're doing?
I can jump in really quickly and just expand on something I touched on in my presentation around growing local skills, Indigenous minority-owned businesses as part of, in Australia, what will be a really new industry. So sort of starting that from scratch and making sure that we're bringing the kind of workforce and supply chain of the future with us is, I think, a really powerful part of growing the SAF industry in Australia for social outcomes.
Great. Frannie or James?
I think for us, we're really trying to be cognizant of, there's a couple different phrases around it, but this notion of environmental justice, and sort of acknowledging that as we continue to sort of innovate and advance and look to new technologies, that we're mindful of those impacts, that we're not sort of creating downstream problems we haven't really thought through, and that we're addressing the responsibility we have when stepping into any sort of operation, right? That we're owning the responsibility we have for certainly the environmental compliance obligations and sort of the stewardship around it. Those things that may potentially be problematic, but certainly identifying those things where there's benefits. If we think around clean energy, and we're potentially evaluating a solar project or something, what are the impacts for the community around it? What are sort of the benefits that we need to be thinking about? We have a global community engagement division within the company, and work very closely with them to ensure that we're sort of really being holistic in that approach to both sustainability, but mindful of what the social impacts are associated with new endeavors.
Great points.
Yeah, and just briefly, I think another really important point in the Australian context, anyways, is thinking about equality of outcomes, equality of opportunities, and really the gap between regional and urban Australia. And there's a big opportunity here for regional Australia, and the other aspect to that is thinking about land use in Australia and some of the trade-offs that we'll face. I mean, we know that there's a big issue in the food versus fuel debate when it comes to crops, and that's a really important discussion that we need to have. And through that study I mentioned a few minutes ago that we're going to be doing with Boeing, that's one of the things that we'll look at is where can we get sustainable crop production where we're not eating into, forget the pun, eating into our food supply, and where we get hopefully the best of both worlds.
I think, Kevin, just quickly to add, globally, when we think about the energy transition, we don't necessarily always think about these hard to abate sectors and fuel. And we were talking, James and I, earlier today, that we really need to. There's hopefully you can see from that chart I had up last, there's a long future for fuels as part of decarbonising aviation. And I think we need to make sure that energy transition is just. That's this really important. And that's a lot of what I could hear Frannie talking to. There's a lot of opportunity here, and I think if we're really mindful about that energy transition, it can be really bringing a lot of people along and out of a lot of unequal circumstances globally.
Absolutely, and I love how all three of you talked about climate justice, because I think for so long the social justice, let's be honest, has been the little brother or the little sibling, I would say, to the environmental side for so long, because people don't focus on the environmental. It's a little more tangible. And by framing it as climate justice as opposed to just climate, it brings in that social element that gets people thinking more creatively, more holistically, and coming out with better solutions in the end. And so I love that all three of you touched on that one point. We are almost at time. And so I want to give kind of a lightning round here to each one of you about, something that just really excites you, that you want to leave the audience with, because I think one of the things that, for those of us that are so excited about sustainable aviation fuels and sustainability is it's hard, because there's a lot of setbacks, and there's a lot of people that keep telling you, no, there's not enough supply, the price is too much, all these other things. But what gets you really excited? What's one thing, just really quick, that the audience should know? And Heidi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure thing. I think the thing that makes me excited is that decarbonising aviation and getting to zero impact aviation, as we like to say at Boeing, is possible. And that is what I see in early careers coming into Boeing, and it inspires them to be the best kind of innovators, especially when we talk about technical areas of work. And that I find super exciting, because not only is that going to solve all of these challenges we have to, but it makes them productive across the entire workforce. It makes them love their work. So that's what I'm excited about.
Frannie?
I think you're certainly right. This is not an easy field to be in. This is a heavy, heavy topic that can pretty easily get you down. And so you've got to sort of celebrate those wins, right? And those wins can feel like an inch here and there and an inch here and there. I think what I like is that we're starting to see some of those inches come a little bit faster. They're happening a little bit closer together. And again, sort of as I had mentioned before, there's this acknowledgement that there's an ownership and a responsibility here across the supply chain to solve for climate change. We've got some work to do. I mean, we're not bringing everybody along. It's not one big happy party, but we're seeing more people get on board with that. And that's also requiring different companies across the supply chain to approach their climate ambitions with integrity, which means that we're seeing true meaningful impact and true meaningful change, or at least the promise of that through real commitments. And so to Heidi's point, it's possible.
That's the most important thing at the end. It's possible. James, last word.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think the thing that excites me most, and it's probably broader than just aviation, but it's this, that we're really seeing the discussion change, right? I mean, 5 years ago, when you were talking about climate and you were talking about emissions, the conversation was all about cost. And what's the cost? What's the drain on the economy to do that? And we're really seeing, probably just in the last couple of years, that now those conversations are turning around to the opportunity. And yeah, SAF isn't economical to produce relative to Jet A at the moment, but we have a lot of really smart people working on it. There's a lot of interest in industry, and it's very exciting. It's energizing to be in those conversations where you can see the light bulb go on and people think, you know what, this is going to be, it's a great opportunity. It's going to create enormous amounts of economic value in the long run as we transition our economies to lower emissions economies. It's going to create an enormous amount of jobs, and I think that's just, you know, as a research organization who collaborate with industry and everything that we do, we're just very excited to be part of that.
Well, this is a great place to hand it back to our hosts, but as your moderator and someone who's worked actually with about 275 different companies on sustainability across the globe and many within the airline industry, I'm inspired coming out of this conversation. And Frannie, I think what you just said in terms of it's possible, and and James, the shift in the mindset of opportunity. And if we can be talking about this from a competitive advantage perspective and putting everything in business terms as opposed to environmental terms for that audience, and putting in a social justice and climate justice for that audience, and economic development language that Heidi is talking about, or even James coming back to the defense and national security strategy that you're talking about in Australia. So Amy, I'm going to pass it back to you for the last word, but thanks everyone for attending tonight. You've been a great audience, and I just want to have everyone thank the panel. Since we're doing it virtually, you can do virtual claps or however you want to do it. But Amy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. I know it gets hard when it's in the evening, but we really appreciate everything that you have done to be here tonight. I want to especially thank our speakers and Kevin for your time, energy, expertise, not just tonight, but as we discussed, the best way to deliver this content and show the intersection between all of your companies, and also the initiatives that are happening between the US and Australia, which is obviously dear to our heart as chambers here in the United States. Also, a special thank you to Don Lillington from San Francisco, and to Doran and Bill from the Pacific Northwest, who were great in helping us get this organized in the panel with a great stellar cast. So thank you all, and consider joining the chambers if you're not. I've put the information in the chat. So thank you all and have a great night.